Now, when we ended last week, we just started looking at Genesis chapter 3, verses 14 to 21, where God metes out the consequences for the rebellion against him. And the Lord curses the snake or the serpent by consigning it to crawl on its belly in the dust all the days of its life. And as I said, this is punishment for its role in the episode. Yes, it's being used by Satan, but still this is punishment for its role in that episode. So it just doesn't make sense to me to claim, as many do, that the serpent was already crawling on its belly and that the curse simply made the serpent's continuing to crawl on its belly a sign of judgment. And as I said, it just seems to me in that case it would be a sign of escaping judgment because nothing had changed. The Lord, it seems to me, is imposing this condition on the serpent. He is changing its mode of locomotion, and the readers are assumed to understand that this change was unpleasant, and therefore it was punitive. That's what I think is going on. I quoted the Old Testament scholar right at the end from a prior generation, C.F. Kyle, to that effect. I could give you a number of other scholarly quotes, but I'll spare you that and just give you one. A scholar from another generation, but a very famous Old Testament scholar named John Skinner. He says, the assumption undoubtedly is that originally the serpent moved erect in some fashion. Now that's how it reads to me, and I think that's right. Now the first clause in Genesis chapter 3 verse 15 says, I will put enmity between you, the serpent, and the woman, Eve, and between your offspring or seed and her offspring or seed. Now there are some who understand this to say, okay, the serpent's offspring, well, those are sons of the serpent in a figurative sense, meaning they are godless humans, rebellious, godless humans. And the descendants of the woman, the seed or the offspring of the woman, they are the godly, faithful people. So what is being said here in their view is that God is saying, I will put enmity between godly people and godless, ungodly people, satanic-like people. Okay? I just don't think that works. I don't think it works because you see in chapter 3, verse 20, Eve is described as the mother of all the living. She is not placed there as some kind of representative of a subset of humanity. She's described as the mother of all the living, and the statement takes place in the context of Eve's rebellion. So I don't think that's the right way to understand what is being said here. Rather, I think this clause refers to the origin of the conflict, the hostility, the enmity between humans and snakes. The dislike and aversion that humans generally have for snakes. Now, I understand there are people who are herpetologists and all this, and they say, oh, these are just beautiful and all that stuff. But generally, there is a hostility and an aversion between humans and snakes. And Gordon Wenham says in his commentary, he says, the human race, her offspring, and the serpent race, your offspring, will be forever at loggerheads. Snakes will fight a running battle with mankind as each tries to destroy the other. Now, this may seem strange to you because we're somewhat, insulated from this in the modern Western world, but snakes can bring death and disfigurement and disability to humans. So most people in the world have little tolerance for them. In fact, the World Health Organization in 2023 says around 81,000 to 138,000 people die each year as a result of snake bites. And around 3 times as many amputations and other permanent disabilities are caused by snake bites annually. So it is no small potatoes. These things are deadly. They are deadly. And here's a picture of a king cobra. And I just look at this thing and I said, oh man, that's some nasty looking dude. Now, I don't know how you, like I said, I know herpetologists, oh, come here, baby, kiss me and all that. Not me. And I just think generally, as I say, people understand this. Now, since there was no death prior to Adam's sinning, you see, he dies in consequence, as we'll see Genesis 3, 17, 19. You see it in Romans 5, 21, 1 Corinthians 15, 21 and 22. The snake's capacity to kill is traceable to this judgment. It's traceable here. God is putting enmity and hostility between humans and snakes, so they were altered at that time to become deadly. They were altered then. And this conflict between humans and snakes, that is part of God's response to sin's invasion of his very good creation. This is something with which this conflict, it was something with which ancient Israelites were very familiar. In Numbers chapter 21, for example, many died from poisonous snake bites. And you see their familiarity with this conflict in Ecclesiastes 10:8 and Amos chapter 5, verse 29. You see it in Acts chapter 28, verses 3 through 6. Now, it's important, I think, to see what is going on here. This conflict between humans and snakes, it serves as a perpetual and stark representation and reminder of the conflict between humans and physical creation that was introduced into the world by the Satan-induced rebellion against God. So this conflict between humans and snakes is this stark and perpetual reminder and representation of this conflict between humans and the physical world that was introduced by Satan. It epitomizes the conflict with creation, that consequence of Satan's work, and thus it symbolizes Satan's opposition to mankind. It is a lesson. It symbolizes that. Now, the second clause in verse 15, what is known as the proto-evangelium, first gospel. That second clause, it says, he shall bruise your head, he shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Head, heel, right? He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. So it speaks of one man, he, singular. Speaks of one man, he, singular, a male descendant of Eve, who shall bruise the head of the serpent, your, singular. Not the serpent's seed, not the serpent's offspring. He shall bruise your head. It alludes to, this alludes to this deeper harmony-destroying conflict between Satan and mankind, to which the enmity that God created between humans and physical snakes points. You see, this deeper conflict, that enmity he creates between humans and snakes, points to this deeper conflict between Satan and mankind. And the conflict between Satan and mankind that is symbolized there in that decreed conflict between humans and snakes, that conflict ends with Christ, the God-man, the male descendant of Eve, prevailing over Satan, the fallen spirit being who animated the serpent in the garden. So this is what I see. I think this is right. Now, of course, people say, oh, no. I think that's right, understanding that way, as the proto-evangelium. That I do see this as an early pointer and hint of the outplaying of the big picture, where it says, he shall bruise your head. He is going to be victorious. over Satan. And then the curse upon the woman in 3:16, the first part, it in some way alters her body so that she and all subsequent women, they experience in childbirth a pain they otherwise would not have experienced. Now, whether stress on tissues during birth, whether that was increased, whether nerve receptors or pathways were altered, whether endorphin production was decreased, or whether there was some other biological or physiological change that was introduced, the pain imposed on childbirth and the transmission of that condition to all subsequent generations. You see there, it's a change in the natural world. You have some people who say that the curse and the fall didn't really alter the natural world at all. But I think that's not right. You clearly have changes in the natural world. It's part of the fallenness and the brokenness in response to sin's invasion. And that's part of what you see here. And then God tells Eve in the second part of 16 that her desire will be for her husband. That's literally what it says. Your desire will be for your husband. You can see the way the ESV does it, shall be contrary to your husband. I'll talk about that in a second. Why they say that, and I think that's accurate. But literally it says your desire will be for your husband. And I think, see there, her desire will be for her husband, probably meaning, when it says your desire will be for your husband, probably meaning that in her now sin-corrupted, fallen nature, her desire will be to control her husband, to reject his leadership right that was given to him by God as part of God's design and created order. You say, well, why do you think the word desire would have that meaning of to control? Well, that word desire, it's Hebrew word teshuka, and it occurs only 3 times in the Hebrew Bible. It occurs here in Genesis 3:16. It occurs 15 verses later in Genesis chapter 4, verse 7. And then it occurs in the lyrical poetry of Song of Songs, chapter 7, verse 11. Now, the occurrence here, you see right here, so you have it in 3:16, and then 15 verses later in 4:7, it occurs again. And the occurrence there in chapter 4, verse 7, where it says that sin desires Cain. You see, and there you can very clearly see that it desires, and what's this? Well, it desires to dominate and control Cain. Okay? Here's what the note to the New English Translation says. Now it's speaking of the occurrence of that word in chapter 4, verse 7 about sin and Cain. It says, as in 3:16, the verse we're looking at, the Hebrew noun desire refers to an urge to control or dominate. Here the desire is that which sin has for Cain, a desire to control for the sake of evil. But Cain must have mastery over it. Now, with regard to taking that as an imperative, must have mastery, they say the imperfect is understood as having an obligatory sense. Another option is to understand it as expressing potential. You can have or are capable of having mastery over sin. It will be a struggle, but sin can be defeated by righteousness. But either way, you see that it seems clear that teshuka there means a desire to control or to dominate, and I think that's what's being said here. Now, referring to a well-known paper from 1975 by a woman named Susan Foe, David Talley, who's an Old Testament scholar, he writes in the New International Dictionary of Old Testament Theology and Exegesis, he says Foe's conclusion that the desire is a contention for leadership, a negative sense, seems probable in Genesis 3:16. Okay, so I'm not making this up. I think that is the right way to understand that. That in her fallenness, she is going to reject God's design for the family there. And so that's why you see, for example, as I say, the phrase says her desire will be for her husband, but yet you see, like the New English translation says, you will want to control your husband. Well, why does it say that? Well, it's saying that because it understands that Teshuka has this nuance to it. And that's the same thing you're seeing here in the English Standard Version, where it says, your desire shall be contrary to your husband. Okay, shall be contrary to your husband. And then God adds in the last clause of verse 16 that this fallen, this corrupted desire will generally go unsatisfied. It will generally go unsatisfied because the husband does, in fact, by divine design, have the leadership role. So you will desire to control your husband, but he will rule over you. Now you have people who want to say that means he's going to be brutal. No, it doesn't. He's going to have the leadership right. He will rule over you, so that will go unfulfilled in you, is part of what he is saying here. That will go unfilled. Now, if that's the correct understanding, and I think that it is, well, then see those people who say, listen, no. You see, male leadership, that's a sinful corruption of God's original intention. Well, in saying that, what I think they're doing is they're unwittingly aiding and abetting women in their rebellion against God. They're saying, no, that's right. You ought to go and deny the leadership role of a husband. Okay, I just think that's a mistake. I think we're barking up the wrong tree with that, but in our egalitarian society, that's what people want to hear. You see, people didn't read this that way for a long time. Do you think it's just coincidental that in our culture this is now finding an ear? I don't think so at all. But anyway, I just think that's interesting that they're doing that, and I think they're, like I said, just teaching exactly wrong and encouraging something I think is wrong. Now, Adam is told in Genesis 3:17-19 that the ground itself is cursed because of his disobedience. And as a result, it would now yield thorns and thistles. So you see, again, a change in the physical world. Sin has now brought a change in the physical world, that things are going to be different, and the ground will be in rebellion to mankind as mankind is in rebellion to God. So that toilsome labor, pain, and the sweat of his face, that's what's now going to be required for you to draw life-giving food out of the ground. It's no longer going to be a walk in the park. It's going to be in rebellion against you. And you're going to have to, through this painful toil in the sweat of your face, produce it. And that's going to be a state that will continue until your now certain physical death, his return to dust. So that's going to be it. You're going to now be in a battle for gaining food. And life is going to be this struggle now, which it wasn't always that way. And as the Spirit later makes clear in Romans chapter 8, verses 19-23, the effect of this fall, it's cosmic in scope. Right? All of creation has been affected and subjected to futility and subjected to the bondage of corruption. Okay, so here's this very good creation. Then here comes sin, this infection that comes in. This tainting of this world, and then God responds to that and curses the creation. Paul says in Romans chapter 5, verse 12, we went through Romans, I don't know how many, I think within the last couple of years, but through Romans, he says in Romans 5:12 that sin entered the human world or the human realm through Adam, and death entered through sin. So you see, so death followed on the heels of sin. It was a byproduct of sin. Adam, the first man, he's held responsible for introducing this plague into the human world, into the human experience. He's what epidemiologists call ground zero. Okay? That's who he is. Now, Paul is well aware that Eve sinned first. He knows that and indicates that in places. But Adam is the representative of mankind in salvation history. See, so he is the one who introduces this. And death came to Adam as God's righteous judgment on sin. God, with that sin, he imposed the death penalty. Which, if you'll remember from Romans, see, this is total death. The death penalty, it involves spiritual, physical, and eternal death. That is what is imposed. John Stott, in his commentary on Romans, he says, Paul's statement that death entered the world through sin is an allusion to Genesis 2:17 and 3:19, where death, both physical and spiritual, is said to have been the penalty for disobedience. And Adam Harwood, in his theology, says the most significant consequence of sin is death, both physical and spiritual. And of course, spiritual death, the separation from God, if that is not healed, well, that then becomes eternal death. You see, so it's total death that they've been sentenced to. And Adam, he died spiritually the day he sinned, right? There are many texts I could give you for this, but just to show you the idea that the consequence of sinning is alienation from God. Classic Isaiah 59:2, but your iniquities have made a separation between you and your God. Your sins have hidden his face from you. He's absolutely holy, atomic white, perfect. And so your sin alienates you from him. Ephesians 2:1 and 2. You were dead in the trespasses and sins in which you once walked. So that alienation is referred to as a death. Right? So this is what is involved when you see Adam died spiritually there, but he also died physically that day, as promised in Genesis chapter 2, verse 17. People say, no, God wasn't right. God says, you'll surely die. He didn't die. No, he did die. You see, he did die in the sense that from that day, God would not sustain physical human life continuously. Okay? Had Adam not sinned, God would have sustained physical human life continuously. But once he sinned, that was no longer the case. So God's prevention of physical death, it was conditioned on Adam not sinning. So when he sinned, God then withdrew that conditional grant and mankind became unconditionally mortal in the physical sense. Mankind became doomed to die. From that day, Adam was a dead man walking. Right? It's like he's gone off the cliff. The question is, when's he going to hit the ground? We don't know. But he's a dead man walking. He's already, and when we looked at Romans, I explained in more detail how that's reasonable to understand that, but I didn't want to chase that. Okay? He's a dead man walking, and all humanity was doomed to die physically. Okay? Those who follow Adam in sin earn their death, so for them it is a sentence and a punishment. Those who die without that, infants and that kind of thing, they die, but they die merely as a consequence of Adam's sin, not as a punishment. And I tried to explain that. I don't know, I've explained that many times. But it's like, you have the husband and wife murderers who they commit murder and they're banished to an island and they have a child on that island. So the child is on that island. He's experiencing the same thing they're experiencing, but the child is not there as punishment. The child is there as consequence. And that's how death is for all those who have not sinned. And by that I mean the incompetent and infants. But all others who sin, then death is a judgment on them. You see, and I explained and went through a lot of that, but I can't redo Romans here. Okay, but I just want to bring that up and say that's how I see that, right? So Adam and Eve's rebellion against God, you see this introduced the sin plague into the human world, thus spoiling, you see, tainting God's very good creation. But God did not scrap the sin-infected world and just start over. Right? So here he has this very good creation. Here comes Satan and introduces sin into the human experience, and he taints and infects this world. Well, God doesn't simply say, okay, round one to you, I'm starting again. No. He chooses rather to redeem the creation, to recover the creation. So he doesn't scrap it. He chooses to redeem it. He chooses to rescue it from the consequences of sin's invasion. And he cursed the natural world as part of his cursing mankind, so that this world now resists mankind's use and purposes as mankind resists God's. So he has cursed the natural world that way, making survival a chore instead of an unmitigated joy. This is the world you and I live in. Right? This is the world we live in. It's now, as I said last week, it is now a dystopian world. It is a world that is stalked by toil, predation, disease, pain, suffering, sorrow, death, all that you and I see and are familiar with. You see, that's this world that has been cursed in reaction to sin's invasion. And the curse that God imposed in response to sin was intended, you see, not only as punishment, but it was intended as the background. Right? It was intended as the background that is necessary in a sin-invaded creation. Okay, that's the world we live in. It's the background. This curse is the background that God knows to be necessary in a sin-invaded creation to optimize his appeal to sinners. Okay, in other words, the pervasive reality of the curse, the things that I just ran through. As you and I look out in the natural world and you see some things that are just horrific. You know, animals being eaten while alive. And all of these kinds of things of insects and things burrowing in brains and all this kind of stuff. The kinds of things that Darwin appealed to say, hey, there's no way that God can be any way involved in this. Oh, he is. You see, he is. You just don't give God enough credit for his knowledge and foresight of what he's doing. Because in this sin-invaded creation, God has cursed this world in such a way to reinforce subliminally, if not consciously, the truth that choosing sin over God yields disaster. So you and I are living in an environment now where we have all of these messages and indications that this world is not the way it's supposed to be. Right? Don't you sense that? Don't you know that? Right? So that's part of the epistemological environment that God has created for us to choose him in a sin-tainted, sin-invaded world. He has set this background for us so that all of these messages we have, we see that this world is not the way it's supposed to be, and he keeps those things, he keeps that fresh. These things provide an ongoing, visceral display of the tragic consequences of rejecting God. That's what this is. This isn't God's original creation. Right? He's going to restore and redeem this broken creation, this cursed creation that has been cursed in keeping with his purpose of optimizing his appeal to people in a sin-drenched world. You see, that's part of it. And I think that's important to recognize. Because people always point to the suffering. One of the greatest atheist claims, they say, listen, there's no explanation for why there's so much horror and suffering and difficulty in the world. If God's all powerful and he knows all things, well, then he'd get rid of all that. Right? But no, listen, God is redeeming things, and in a sin-invaded world, God is now seeking to have people respond to him. And how do you know what it takes, mere, flawed, broken, sinful mortal? How do you know what it takes to optimize the appeal in such an environment? Are you going to sit in judgment of God? Oh, I happen to know. Yes. No, he went overboard on that. That was too much. He shouldn't have allowed that level of distress to happen. Oh, come on. It's just to me a joke to sit and think that you can look at God like that. I just say God is in control and he knows. And I know he's perfectly good because the cross of Christ tells me forever that he loves me to death. So you're never going to get me to believe that he's bad. I know that's not true. So I'm looking at this world and saying, what does the very good, loving God do? And that's what I'm trying to get you to see. Can you prove that? Does the Bible? It doesn't spell that out. I'm trying to help you think through some of these things to say, what do you think about all of this evil and suffering? I'm saying the evil and suffering that you have, that no one can point to that and say for certain that it is gratuitous, that there is no overarching good purpose for it to exist. How could there be a good purpose? I can't really tell you other than to say it is part of the epistemological environment that God has placed us in so that we know and understand that this place is not the way it's supposed to be, and that is because we went against God. And so the answer then is to, well, what's the solution? Come to God. You see, come to God because he is at work and he is going to redeem this creation. You see, he's going to redeem it. So since God now also, with regard to this curse that he's done, since he desires a multitude of redeemed humans to spend eternity with him in the new heavens and the new earth, you see, the cursed creation, right, has to continue until the full number that God desires has responded and come in. So then you see that requires that the elements of the curse then have to be designed in such a way to sustain the functionality of the biosphere for that length of time. Right? He has to do that. So in this way, even fallen creation, you see, represents God's wisdom and glory. So we can look at even fallen creation and praise him for his wisdom and glory in how he's arranged it as part of his counteraction against sin's invasion. He's cursed creation in such a way that a world that is red in tooth and claw will continue for however many millennia are necessary for his purpose. He has arranged and balanced everything to continue for that purpose. So he remains the ultimate source of provision for his creatures, even predators. Right? In this fallen world, who feeds the predators? Well, he has. Because he has arranged this fallen world so that it will continue until his purpose is achieved. So who gets the credit for them? He does. And you can turn to text and see that. Right? So he's even balanced and arranged everything that way. So he's rightly praised for that, and he's praised for the integration of all the parts and for the ongoing balance of the entire system. He's given praise for that. Now, creation continues to serve and to glorify God, but because creation now does so, right, with the inclusion of remedial evil. Right? So here we have sin's invasion. God curses the world to optimize the environment for the choosing of him in a sin-drenched world. So it's different now, right? It's different. It continues to serve and glorify him, but it now does so with the inclusion of this cursed remedial evil that wasn't present before sin's invasion. It does so in a way that is necessitated by sin's invasion. So therefore, the current functioning of this world, this cursed world, this dystopian world, this world that is not the way it's supposed to be, you can see that in a sense, this world can be viewed as an enemy, right? It can be viewed as something that is opposed to God, even though he is the source of it and he rules over it. Now you can be saying, well, is that double talk? What's this guy doing? Is he saying, no, look, you see this illustrated perfectly. I think you see it illustrated perfectly, the coexistence of these differing perspectives in the case of human death. Right? Human death. God in his righteousness and thus to his glory, he imposed death on mankind because of sin. And yet we see that death is identified as the last enemy to be expunged from the corrupted creation. So do you see there's a sense of, who brought about the death in response? God did. Well, how can it be called an enemy if God did it? Because they're differing perspectives. You see, it is at odds with his initial and eternal vision for creation where the redemption is going. So there's a sense in which it is his enemy, even though he is the one who brought it about. And I think that's important to see in understanding what is going on in the world. So without knowing just how the curse functions, as I said, just how it functions as a necessary background for his purpose in the sin-invaded creation, we're just not in a position to judge God about that. Though everybody does. How could a God do this? How could a God do that? Well, I'm going to ask him. Right? I mean, you just have to see how much greater he is than you. And he's doing something, but like I said, you know that he is a loving God. So he's working, and there's also a difference I think is important to see. Let's see, by introducing this remedial difficulty, evil, suffering, in response to sin's invasion, do you see that's different than if God had created that way in the initial instance? There's a moral distinction there, you see. In cursing the world in response to sin's invasion, that is redeeming the world. That is working for a good purpose in light of sin's invasion. If in the first instance God creates through predation and death and suffering like the evolutionists insist is true, well, that's different. Right? He has no constraint he's working under in responding to sin's invasion, if he did it in the first instance. So there's a difference there. So yes, I think this fallen world is God's response to sin's invasion. But I don't think it's culpable or wrong because he's doing it for a noble and good purpose. He's doing it to draw people. Well now, that's discouraging. Okay. All right. All right. Bernard thought I wouldn't get through this, but I'm going to have to do it. Okay, Adam names his wife Eve because she's the mother of all the living. You see that and so here we have the couple. I'll skip through these. Kenneth Matthews says, yes, all human life, source in her body. Okay. But I want you to see that as the genetic diversity that God included in Adam and Eve, which I assume was maxed out. You see, even maximizing the genetic diversity in the woman's eggs. Okay, I assume this diversity is maxed out. And as it was sorted through the segregation of populations, as it mutated through the generations, and as it passed through the bottleneck of Noah and the flood, that singular human bloodline, she's the mother of all the living, that singular human bloodline differentiated into all the various racial and ethnic groups that have existed. Okay, but despite all the variation you see among people, we are all one huge family. You see, one huge family. The human family, the human race. And the enemy has exploited these surface differences against us and has created havoc with these things, with these ethnic, racial, and other distinctions. Okay, as reported in 3:21, the Lord clothed Adam and Eve with garments of animal skin, which I think with hindsight, we see that symbolizes that the remedy for human sin is beyond human effort, right? The loincloths that they had fashioned from fig leaves, those things did nothing. Mankind's sin can only be removed from God's sight by God, which he will do through sacrifice. And so you see that implicit here, like Kenneth Matthews. Let me get back to Matthews. He says, although the text doesn't specify that animals were slain to provide these coverings, it's a fair implication. And one that likely would be made by the Mosaic community, given that animal sacrifice was pervasive in the tabernacle. So these animals, you see, from whom the coverings were obtained to cover Adam and Eve, they had done these loincloths of fig leaves. That's nothing. God gets involved and he provides these animal skins for them, and those skins are a type. Okay, the ultimate antitype of which would be the male descendant of Eve alluded to in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, the Lord Jesus Christ. He's going to be the sacrifice that will actually block your sin, you see, make your sin, take it away, so that it will no longer be in God's sight. Okay, I got to hustle here, I got a minute. Okay, Genesis 3, 22 and 24. Don't even think I can read it. 22a, right? He says, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. In saying that, he's not saying that the serpent's word had come to pass. You see, that eating the forbidden fruit, that humanity had then become omniscient. That's certainly false, right? You understand that. Scripture, history, universal experience reveals that you and I are not omniscient. Okay? We have not become like God in knowing good and evil. Rather, he's saying that in defying the express command not to eat of the tree, we acted like God's equal. In terms of knowing good and evil, in terms of being capable of and entitled to judge whether the fruit of that particular tree should be available for our eating. So God said you're not to eat of it. In eating of it, we acted like we are in a position to make the call over you. Right? So that's what he's talking about. They overrode God's judgment, claiming by their action to be his equal, to know as he knows, and therefore not to be subject to his will. And that's the perennial and the fundamental temptation to mankind, right? To usurp the prerogative of God. That's it for us. That's what always the pull is. I know better. I'm going to ignore that for a minute because I'm so close and I can't do next week. So stick with me for just a second. As I previously said, regarding the tree of life, it seems that God had bound himself that he would provide physical life to those who ate of the fruit of that tree. And so having condemned them to die, he therefore has to block the way back, or he'd be bound to provide them. So he sentences them to death. He's not going to allow them to come and have access to a tree that he's bound. If you eat of it, I'm going to give you life. So they are banned. They're cut off from access to that. Last thing I'll say. We're not told how long Adam and Eve were in the garden before they sinned, but it couldn't have been very long. Okay, Adam and Eve were created sinless. They were commanded to procreate. Being sinless, they would have taken that task seriously. They would have soon begun engaging in sexual intercourse. And given that they were created in perfect health, as implied by the fact creation is very good, Eve would have conceived a child in short order, whatever that would be. Okay? But they had already sinned and been expelled from the garden when their first child, Cain, was conceived. You see that in Genesis 3:6 and 3:24 to 4:1. So they couldn't have been in there very long. How long, we're not told. But they wound up sinning. I raced through that last part. You hung in there. I owe you. Thanks.